All right.
All right, Brother Jahan.
Here again.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
New setting, same
Yep.
house, new setting.
Yep. Set and setting. But great setting. People can't see it, but behind the camera is a phenomenal set of katanas.
Yes, yep.
Very impressive.
My grandfather made the cabinet that it's sitting
Oh, wow. Yeah.
in. He's 94, I think.
Longevity
like that.
Represent.
Yeah. This is like the last thing he made before his sort of eyesight got too bad as well.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, it means a lot. It's good. Good
Yeah.
cabinet.
It's fantastic. Yeah. Saunas.
Saunas. I love this field. I absolutely love it. For multiple different reasons too.
I mean, just saunering itself is like a pretty great little activity all on its own.
Yeah, exactly. Isn't it good when you find something that you really like doing and then you find out it's good for you?
Oh, for sure.
As well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is totally the case with saunas. I have liked them thinking it was really good for your health. Just like exercise. I found exercise to be really fun and liked it. And then just turns out it's good for you, which is
The dream.
such a good byproduct.
It really is. Really is. And lucky in many senses. I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily appreciate that perspective. I do.
Yeah.
But a lot of people don't enjoy exercise.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I block it in as a chore in the way I like build my week. You know, I have to do exercise this day or that day and for this long.
Yeah.
So I treat it like a chore, but then once I start, I'm like, oh yeah, I like this.
But that's really true of exercise in general. And like a lot of things that feel difficult to start, but then once you start doing it, it's like actually quite enjoyable. But that activation energy required to start it, I don't know. I bet if you did an fMRI study, like it would light up like pain centers in the brain to try and start it. And it's like this active neural pathway against starting these things for whatever reason.
But then once you start, it can light up on a pleasure pathway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a weird paradox, I guess.
And it's odd how like a lot of people like paying for a gym membership or like paying for a club membership because it holds them accountable and they feel like they need to, like if it's too easy, if it's just in your garage, you end up never doing it.
Yeah.
Which was an interesting thing in COVID. Even me, who like very much addicted to exercise, during COVID, I got so sick. Before I had bought myself a set of weights, I was so sick of cardio that I was just really running low on the idea of exercise. I still did it, but it was a different type of interaction or relationship that I had with it.
Cardio is an interesting one. Like it can be pretty boring, but I think if you get outside, and COVID was limiting in that sense, but you could still go for a bike ride, for example, and that was sort of COVID safe.
Yeah.
As long as you weren't in a big pack group. But I just do like solo bike rides around a criterium track. And the advantage of that kind of cardio is that you have to deal with cornering. And so you get like an extra element of like, geez, took that corner a bit hard, or like, you know.
Yeah.
And so that's a way of making cardio, I guess, a bit interesting.
Yeah, true. Oh, COVID has definitely changed this year quite a bit.
Yeah. And as we speak, a new cluster has shot up in Adelaide.
Yeah, yep. The once protected state.
Yeah. And then immediately Queensland and Western Australia shut their borders.
I didn't know that. Okay,
Yeah. And so South Australia feeling the burn from that perspective. But I like Victoria and New South Wales being the mature adults being like, you can't just shut the borders every time.
Yeah.
Which is true, you can't.
Yeah.
Need to think about what precisely your strategy is. And having been through the melee up, Victoria, I think, has a pretty mature approach now.
Yeah. I agree. It's a very politicized debate going on right now, how to handle it, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's good to be on this side of the Victorian approach.
I was really certain that after this first lockdown, and it's been like terrible and crap, and now it's starting to ease in Victoria, that we wouldn't put up with another lockdown. But I suspect if it happens, if we get another thing, we probably will go into a lockdown again.
Yeah, I think so.
I think we will. And
It'll
I will.
be hard for the government to do anything but that, I think, to justify doing it in the first place almost.
Yeah. But fortunately, I think we'll do like targeted smaller lockdowns.
Yeah. Which is a lot more realistic as well, right?
Yeah.
Because if there's no corona in a large area, then there's no need to do lockdown.
The benefit of being a battle-hardened state from that perspective.
Yeah, totally used to it.
I was very jealous about Adelaide and South Australia and all these other states getting to go out, getting to do all the things that, live a normal life.
Yeah.
But I think we're probably in a better situation because we have the mechanisms in place to deal with stuff in like a better way. I think going forward.
Yeah.
Would be my intuition. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
We'll see how South Australia handles it.
Well, it's changed the way I live. I've set up my life again, revolving around exercise. Now, Laura and I formed a bubble with her parents' house as soon as we could, and my father-in-law's got this great sort of commercial gym set up, and so now I've let my gym membership lapse at the commercial one. I don't think I'll ever go back there because I've hit like the trifecta, man. I go to my in-laws, so my wife's happy because she gets to see her family. My daughter's happy because she gets to interact with her grandparents.
Totally.
And like Laura gets a little bit of break. Her mum will take care of her. Her sister's there as well. And then I go out, interact with my father-in-law, work out in this amazing gym setup, and then he's got the sauna as well.
Mate, it's an amazing setup.
Yeah, it's the best setup. It's so good.
And it's a nice looking sauna too.
Yeah, it's a good size. I think it's marketed as is it a 5-man or a 3? Realistically, it's a 3-person sauna. It might be marketed as a 5-man sauna. Yeah,
but you'd be squeezing like sardines.
Yeah. You could do it, but it wouldn't be very comfortable. It's an infrared sauna. Yep. Which I'm a big fan of. Yep. I remember when we were discussing it before he got it, you were a bit like, because you had one infrared sauna.
I've had one infrared sauna, and I was just sort of underwhelmed by the experience. My experiences have always been in the Finnish sauna style with hot rocks, dry heat, cedar wood, just like radiating all over your body, and then you throw that water on. It's like, and that to me is like the pinnacle of sauna. Yeah.
I agree with you. I think that is because they are a different experience, and that is the best type of sauna experience. Yep. But very difficult to achieve on like a cost-effective and economic.
I have been looking into both options.
Oh yeah, okay.
And we can sort of break down maybe for the at-home user what pricing sort of structures I've sort of found. At least in an Australian context. Yeah. And you can get similar. So for the infrared sauna, you can get sort of a 1 to 2 person around that $1,000 or $1,500 mark, and it's a pretty reasonable product. Yep. You can get a similarly priced like a Finnish style sauna, like 1 to 2 person flat pack comes together for a similar price. So for a 1 to 2 person sauna, and realistically it's a 1 person sauna, as we were talking about, right. 2 people, pretty cozy. So you want it to be sort of an intimate partner. But for that 1 to 2 person sauna, the only real difference is that the Finnish style sauna, you need to connect to the mains. Like its energy requirements are going to be pretty significant. Yes. In comparison. And so potentially your electricity bill will be a little bit higher for the Finnish style. But the prices, I think, are pretty comparable.
Okay. Yeah. To be honest, I didn't even look into it. I just assumed the Finnish style is going to be way more expensive. So connecting to the mains, a little bit of a drawback, but if you've got an appropriate setup, that'd be fine, I guess.
Exactly, yeah. And I guess there's the cost of the electrician to do that, because technically you're not allowed to do it yourself. Unless you're licensed.
Yeah. And then, like, they take longer to heat up and stuff like that? The usability?
Well, I think from my understanding, so I guess I don't have a full level of knowledge, but my understanding of the Finnish style sauna is that it would probably be a similar temperature to heat up. Right. Just because by virtue that the volume of space you're heating up is going to be similar.
I see. Yeah.
So whether it's infrared or Finnish style. And you know what? Like, heat energy is always infrared energy. So in a way, what's really the difference between infrared versus Finnish style sauna? It's all infrared radiation.
The ambient temperature difference, which is talked about a lot in the literature, that's the thing they seem to focus on as a differentiating factor. But getting into Jeff, my father-in-law, getting into Jeff's sauna, the ambient temperature is definitely hot. We sort of
Yes.
we do most of our saunas like 60, 65 degrees, somewhere in there.
Mm.
Have done ones up to like 75 degrees. The ambient temperature, I probably would put pretty darn close to the like as advertised temperature. But then we sit in the corner. There's like an infrared plate on the side, in front of you and behind you.
Mm.
Versus if you sit right in front of the clear door, you've only got sort of the plates a bit further away and nothing in front of you. There's a difference there. So it is majority of how close you're sitting towards these infrared plates.
Yeah.
But the ambient temperature is still pretty darn high.
Yeah.
It's not as high as the traditional Finnish sauna, but even the literature I've looked into, it's all the benefits are sort of seen in not all, there's very much a spectrum to this, but 65 degrees, 30 minutes, you're good as gold in terms of getting the advertised benefits.
Yeah. To break down to break down the exact mechanisms between the types of saunas might be interesting.
Yeah.
So infrared radiation is a type of radiation, and essentially the two different ways that these saunas are dissipating that radiation are quite different. So infrared saunas target a beam of radiation.
Yeah.
So it's like if you could almost think of it like a laser, right? It's sort of like actual waves of radiation coming out.
Getting shot at you, yeah.
Which is a bit different to the way, a hot rock or like a heat source would dissipate radiation, where it heats up the particles around it rather than sort of a beam coming at itself.
It's much more like a radiating outward hitting you.
Yeah, so a Finnish style sauna is actually relying on heat transfer through the air, whereas an infrared sauna is not. It's relying on those beams of radiation hitting you and heating you up. Yeah. And I think that's like the fundamental difference. Yeah. Or the theoretical difference.
Which in practice matches very well.
Yeah.
Because of the positional changes you can do in this sauna. Traditionally it's just the higher you are versus the lower you are in Finnish style sauna. Yeah. But that's also true in the infrared one, but it's very much, if you sit closer to the plates versus further away from the plates, like less targeted infrared hitting you. And I'm not sure what a Finnish style sauna says about depth of penetration of the heat. But infrared seems to be a marketing thing. Yeah, that they say the depth
because it's not relying on heating the ambient air, it's relying on heating you. In theory, I suppose that targeted infrared radiation hitting you maybe goes deeper.
Yeah.
I don't know. One thing that I notice, one big difference I noticed between the two was when you're in a Finnish style sauna and the temperature gets like 80, 90 degrees, like when you're inhaling, like it's burning.
Yeah.
It's burning. And so you're hitting lungs, which is sort of an interesting interesting phenomenon because you're breathing in like superheated air.
Yeah.
Which you're not doing in an infrared sauna.
What are your thoughts on that? I think it's probably better in an infrared sense then.
Maybe. So it depends on how you think the sauna is acting.
Okay, what do you mean?
In terms of like the heat shock proteins and like the fundamental biology of how saunas are supposed to be good for you. Yeah.
Which we should probably get to, I guess.
Yeah. Because ultimately all you're really doing is heating the outside, which is hugely important because, the skin is your largest organ.
Yeah.
So if you're heating up and like heat shocking the largest organ in your body, you can imagine it's going to do something. Then you have a difference where the Finnish style sauna is also suddenly affecting your airways as well, potentially.
Yeah.
The other thing I would note as well is that the Finnish style sauna, you definitely cannot stay in for as long.
Yeah.
So when you get up to that 80, 90 degrees, you're staying in for 5-10 minutes, then you have to get out, have a cold shower, and then get back in.
Yeah, much more of the in and out process, which is it's an entirely sort of different method or approach to saunas, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really different. And I guess, what would be the reason for that? Is it, the stress to breathing that means you have to leave? Or is it the fact that the heat is actually just much more overpowering and you're getting more of a heat shock?
Yeah.
And your body's responding to that heat shock more. For me, the whole point is that you're stressing your body. You're providing a heat-related stress that's triggering these mechanisms. And if you're going to if you're going to ask the question, well, what stresses you more? Well, it seems like Finnish sauna stresses you more.
Yeah, that's very true. I agree with that heuristic.
Yeah.
But then I think you need to apply the same sort of approach to exercise, right? Like, if you're talking about some, like 3-month training period where you want to try and hit peak performance, so your training program's going to look very different to a maintenance style approach to training.
True. Yeah.
So if you want like fast, rapid, intensive, definitely couldn't keep this up for the rest of my life sort of approach.
Yeah.
That seems to fit more with the Finnish, like quick results or dose, bursting your regular regime. Because if you go to the gym, you can't be hitting your personal best every single session, right? Although recently that seems to be what Jeff and I are doing. We push each other so hard. But yeah, you can't keep up an everyday training regime of massively heavy weight sort of thing. You've got to cycle it. It's frustrating as that is for most people who are serious about their training. In karate, it's phenomenal how true that is. Like you set a tournament target date or something for 3 months. And you ramp your training up in the lead up to it. And you definitely do after the tournament, you hit a new basal level that's much higher than previous. But you definitely drop.
Yeah.
Definitely drop. And it's just such a weird byproduct of reality, it seems.
Yeah.
You can't keep that level up.
When you're running on like a competition schedule and you've built up to pre-competition fitness, maybe you've had a small taper just before the competition. You've hit the competition. There's a psychological component too, because everything's finished, it's over, it's done. The goal's achieved.
True.
And so you probably don't have the same motivation to hit it as hard afterwards.
You've got to be tricking yourself into the motivation side of things as well, right? Yeah. There's got to be a carrot dangling in front of you.
Absolutely. I don't know, maybe you have multiple tournaments a year. So then the whole thing starts again. Yeah. And then 3 months later, you do it all over again.
And the karate world in Australia is just getting busier and busier with more and more tournaments or fighting opportunities. And I've sort of stepped away from the competition scene in a big way in the last few years, med school and working as a junior doctor. But some of my close friends like Michael Dent, Samuel Shields, David Wismith, they're all fighting like every 2 to 3 weeks.
Yeah, right.
And so I don't have personal experience in this regard, but talking to them, they say that they feel better for it because the nervousness that everyone feels, regardless of what people say, they got so used to that they really did feel like they really had a low level of anxiety and weren't that scared to be going onto the mat.
Interesting.
Because they were sort of used to it. And then when COVID happened, they missed it. They missed that bus. Sort of got addicted.
It makes a lot of sense. In a sense, if you analogize it to, a musician who's going on stage every week versus going on stage twice a year. The person going on every week is probably going to perform better.
Yeah. They're way more comfortable in that approach.
Yeah.
And I could see it. Like, their level of fighting is much higher than when I was at my prime. Because they've got that high level of experience and
what
the
high
fight
like,
IQ.
Train how you fight.
Yeah, exactly. And so it kind of was a training session for them.
If every competition is essentially a training session, then...
Definitely. Which I'm kind of... I want to get back into. But I think sauna, there's some sort of analogy to be made there. And there's not much evidence to back this up. But
I'd say some of the evidence points against that, only by virtue of the fact that, when you PubMed this particular topic, the only sauna style that seems to have a better effect or has some evidence to support it is really the Finnish style in terms of the epidemiological evidence and that sort of thing.
Oh, really? I found pretty good evidence for both. Yeah.
Okay.
Tell me more. I think the reason why I'm seeing this, there might be like a bias towards it because infrared saunas are so much easier to implement. So they're becoming more and more common over the landscape, probably in the last decade or so. And the use of home saunas and stuff like that, which isn't actually represented in the literature, but that's becoming more and more common.
Definitely.
But nearly all of the cardiovascular health benefits I saw were from infrared saunas.
Interesting.
Most of them.
Because, I guess what I'm thinking about are really those studies that look at the Finnish style sauna and look at Finnish populations
cohort studies.
and correlate
Yeah,
like the amount someone saunas with less cardiovascular disease and improved like longevity phenotypes.
I agree. The cohort studies are very much Finnish.
But again, of course, you have the fraught element of epidemiological studies.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I guess the Finnish population does represent some kind of natural experiment from that perspective.
Yeah, I would agree. Even with the limitations in mind, it's good quality evidence.
I think so.
Yeah.
So, tell me a little bit more about this infrared evidence. Like, what kind of studies were they?
They were mostly RCTs.
Yeah.
Single center or multi-center. There's a fantastic review article that I'm basing most of my ideas from because it's great. It's such a good article. I've read the whole thing top to toe a couple of times, and I'm really, really happy with how they've done the study. And I think there's only 1 or 2 studies that they found that went beyond 30 minutes, up to sort of a max of 40 to 45 minutes. Nearly all the temperatures were in a range of 45 degrees up to about 65 degrees. I think the lower temperatures were for rheumatoid and ankylosing spondylitis sort of targeted approaches. And it's fair to say that it's beneficial in nearly every sort of regard. And so the only sort of thing to then break down is the outcome measures and how concrete they are. Because there's a lot of evidence to show it's good for depression and pain scores and things, but they're very sort of subjective outcome measures, like asking patients how they feel about certain things. So then it gets a bit murky with the placebo effects, things like that. But the main bulk that impressed me so much was the cardiovascular outcome measures. So things like congestive heart failure, it showed really statistically significant results for things like the 6-minute walk, like how far they can walk in 6 minutes. And then looking at the hard numbers, I think the difference was like high 30s, low 40 meters to high 40s to low 50s in terms of meters. So not that much of an overall difference, but still statistically significant. But thankfully, it showed a difference in the New York Heart Association criteria. So less class 3 and 4 patients.
How long were these people sauning for, like over a period of time?
All that, like collectively looking at the study is quite a range, but anywhere between 2 weeks up to 5 months.
Wow. Okay.
And even at 2 weeks, it was showing great benefits.
Yeah, in actually like the NYHA class.
MIH class, yeah.
Wow.
And what was the other factor? I'll think of it soon. But yeah, it was the 6-minute walking, NYHA, and something else that impressed me quite a lot. Because it's not that logical, right? I mean, it is one. It's kind of like the graph sort of dips up and down. On first glance, you think a sauna probably isn't great for someone with congestive heart failure, right?
Yeah.
So these people, their heart isn't pumping as well. They have problems with fluid retention. They have problems with blood pressure. Prone to postural hypertension, getting up and down can make them feel dizzy, can fall. So putting them in a hot environment where you're going to sweat a lot, you're like, that seems like it's going to muddle up your system a bit too much. Probably wouldn't recommend it. And even like commercial saunas would advise against, totally. Those warnings, you've got a heart condition, don't be in here until you can check with your doctor. More strict people require a doctor's letter before they'll let you go in. Which is honestly based on an honesty system. Just don't tell them and you'll be fine. But then if you take it sort of one step further and really think about what's going on, that it does make sense that a sauna is going to be great for these people. Like in the hospital setting, we try to diurese or get rid of this fluid off these people in so many different ways. Yeah, that's true. And a sauna is going to do it for you. Yeah. But the adverse side effects that they always tout are low blood pressure. Weight loss is interestingly categorized as an adverse outcome a lot of the time. I'm not too sure why really, but people lose between 0.1 up to 0.5 kilos routinely in each of these sauna sessions. Okay, is that just standing on the scales weight or? Yeah. So I guess that might be a component where if you're doing it really regularly, it's just you're running a lower fluid status. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. But yeah, impressive result. Very impressive. These are, I think there were 1 or 2 Finnish, but largely targeted towards infrared. Yeah.
really interesting.
Which I think you're right, recognizing that it's a difference between ambient temperature and how the heat is affecting you. But at the end of the day, it's heat on your body.
It's heat on the body.
So it doesn't seem to make too much of a difference.
Mm.
So then I sort of switched towards, all right, well, what's just more pragmatic for my life?
Yeah.
Infrared, I think, is a lot more pragmatic. You don't have to hire an electrician, you just plug it straight in the wall. Yeah. You can move it around your house.
Yeah. It's hard to argue the convenience of that fact. But
yeah.
I think for me, moving forward, when I finally do invest in a sauna setup, it will be Finnish.
Yeah.
I think. I've put a lot of thought into this, and just by virtue of longevity of enjoyment of the process, I'm just going to enjoy the process if I can pour some hot water onto hot rocks. And it, I don't know, you want that sort of like internal contentment from like, I don't know, just doing something that feels a bit more primal.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I agree with you, actually. I think I'm going to have two. I think in the next sort of decade or so of my life, I'm going to, probably in the next year, I'll end up buying an infrared sauna when I move away from my father-in-law.
Yeah.
But the end goal, dream house setup, everything the way I want it, will probably be a Finnish style dedicated sauna. And I'm talking about a room.
But if you can only do one, and, all you can do is the infrared, then probably infrared is fine.
Yeah, rest assured it seems fine.
Yeah.
And I think, it matches the heuristic, right? Like the end result is just heat on your body, and the studies seem to show that that's all that really counts.
Yeah. That's super interesting. Heat on the body, not just human bodies, but other organisms tends to increase their lifespan, which is super interesting.
Yeah.
So C. elegans, the little worm that they often do studies on, heat them up, they live longer. Drosophila, heat them up, they live longer. And it's pretty interesting why. So
Yeah.
And to link it back to other stuff we've talked about, it sort of works in a similar way to metformin. It works in a similar way to fasting, working at the level of the phagosome, and stimulating autophagy and mTOR pathways and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So it really sits in that junction there.
Which is why we've honed in on it, right? Like,
yeah, totally.
It's that classic thing of, you've got these cohort studies that say people who do Finnish saunas, they seem to have less of these conditions, heart disease, less of, or like sort of rattle them all off. And that's the same sort of targeted approach that aging seems to correlate with. You age and you naturally have more of these diseases.
Yeah.
So that saunas decrease these diseases can sort of be alluding to the fact that maybe it's targeting the same central core issue of aging.
Absolutely.
And the more they've looked into it, the more that seems to be correct.
Yeah. What I find interesting as well is the fact that I'm going to make the claim that saunas really only affect the skin as an organ, but that hitting the skin and stressing just the skin seems to affect all organ systems. It's affecting the heart. It's affecting everything. So linking that cellular level with cellular autophagy, cellular mTOR activation or inhibition, those sort of pathways, linking that with a tissue, the skin, and then linking that with the whole organism.
Yeah.
Again, you see this sort of repeated pattern of a tissue. I think this sits... So if I was going to think about where this sits on that sort of hierarchical level, I'd say... And just to remind ourselves what the hierarchical level is, you have cellular aging, you have tissue aging, you have like full organism aging. I think this is affecting tissues, and then the tissues are sending off signals. So it's not the organism level, it's not the cellular level, it's a tissue level that then affects the cellular and organism level.
I completely agree. Yeah. And I also think we should come up with a name for this, like a Jahan's theory of connectivity or something.
It's definitely not my theory.
I know, but I like to think that it is.
I like to frame everything in that picture because I think it contextualizes everything, and you don't get too bogged down in thinking cellular aging is everything, and you don't get too bogged down in, and it gives you that big picture, which I think is useful.
I completely agree, and it's not that foreign a concept, right? Like,
no.
If you can quickly put resistance training into the same category.
Yeah.
You can put you're stressing a tissue, a muscle tissue.
Yes.
That then will have systemic wide effects, and you can break it down quite easily into the cellular effects that it has. Thinking
about what sauna can do then in this model, would make me wonder whether if you took someone who had, say, deranged sleep patterns or, that central tissue, the brain, whether you could affect that. So if you had someone who had Alzheimer's or an aged person with deranged sleep, would saunaing help with that?
Yeah.
That's a question. Probably.
Yeah, that's a really good question. On a surface level, at first glance, saunas are definitely implicated in good sleep hygiene.
Yeah.
Because this seems, I don't know if people will agree, but it seems paradoxical to me that lowering your body temperature helps initiate sleep.
Yes.
I know that's true, but it seems to always be counterintuitive to me.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think of a hot room on a summer's day and everyone sort of gets sleepy.
Yeah.
But the reason why, like, you have to, again, take it one step further, and if you do have an elevated temperature, like in a sauna, it's the getting out of the sauna. And so you've got this increased blood flow, this increased heat transfer happening in your body, where your body's trying to get rid of this increased core temperature.
Yep.
And it's that's the release of heat energy from your body that lowers your core body temperature and initiates sleep. So counterintuitive to me. But yeah, good sleep hygiene means dropping your core body temperature.
Yeah.
Which is why, you're under the covers, you're nice and warm, and for some reason you want to sneak your little foot out.
My toes have to be out.
Yeah. Yeah. So you heat everything up, and then you've got this escape, which will lower your core body temperature, and boom, you're off to sleep.
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder if there's a fundamental difference in biology between men and women from that perspective. Because women just seem to love a really toasty bed. Like, way too toasty.
Yeah, yeah. And like putting their feet on the top, which is always such a cold experience. Yeah. But yeah, so even on a surface level, there's an idea of incorporating a sauna to improve your sleep hygiene. Yeah. Which will then have those further effects. But I think what you were saying is a more directed, targeted approach on actually managing that centralized process of sleep disturbance. Which, interesting.
I don't know. I haven't looked into it, but have you seen anything about like NAD, like redox state, and saunaing, on what the effect would be on that? My intuition would be that it'd improve that redox state, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, my intuition would agree. But no, I haven't seen any direct evidence. That's loosely based to how this all came about in the first place. The guy who was studying Drosophila, he noticed this chromosomal puffing, or the heat shock response. And what sort of drew him to it was that at the time that there was some thinking around how the electron transport chain was generating energy based on these water crystal states of the cell. I think it was, obviously a bit erroneous at the time, but he thought he was melting these crystals and changing the redox state of the cells based on the heat shock, which sort of drew him into it. He was famously quoted as saying, like, "This may or may not be right. I don't care. It's more a link between imagining and reality." Yeah. And likened it to love. Oh, wow. I thought it was like a really cute little thing. Like, I'm interested in this and I don't care if it's right. It's just cool that I can link the two things, and it's as crazy as love. I'm like, it's nice for a scientist to say.
I think a lot of the best scientists are very poetic, very creative people.
Yes, I agree. Because they tend to be widely disciplined in their approach to things, right? Including the use of language or communication. But yeah, I think it would make sense if it's affecting NAD levels or through a redox state. And most of the literature seems to point towards heat shock proteins themselves, right?
Heat shock proteins and their interaction with autophagy. Yeah. And stimulating the breakdown of proteins. Yeah. Which makes sense heuristically, because we know that if you increase heat of things, then that denatures proteins, makes them, destroys their function, and so you need to get rid of them. Yeah. So if your body is sensing excessive heat, it'll want to create mechanisms to get rid of denatured proteins that have
get rid of denatured ones and go ahead and protect ones that they don't want to be bothered by the heat.
Just as important. Yeah.
So to explain the term heat shock protein, it's you develop this heat shock, i.e. sauna, or even arguably exercise that raises your temperature. So your body will produce these so-called heat shock proteins, these proteins that mainly degree act as like a chaperoning response?
Yeah, there's certainly they certainly so there's in autophagy there's that chaperone mediated autophagy, and so they assist in that sort of pathway of chaperoning proteins to become broken down and targeting proteins to become broken down.
Yeah. So it sort of comes along, holds their hand, takes them to the right part where either they're protected if they're too important, or takes them to a plate and says, "This is the end for you, and get rid of these dodgy proteins." Yeah, which it matches so well in with the fasting approach, the exercise approach, the calorie restriction stuff. You want to just get rid of all the junk within the cell, and that's looking at the cellular level. Interestingly, which goes on towards your more systemic-wide approach, there was this very elegant study done by a Japanese group in the early 2000s, I think it was, which was looking at the oxidative stress or the nitric oxide approach to endothelial damage. So the blood vessels throughout your body aligned with an endothelium. It's like the cell type. And classically, you get this endothelial damage that can lead to things like atherosclerosis or peripheral vascular disease, where, broadly speaking, it's just a clogging up of these vascular pathways, damage to the endothelium. And the reason why I called it an elegant study, so they were measuring a urinary protein, I forget the name, its scientific name, which sort of is an indicator of endothelial damage and the nitric oxide response. And saunaing decreased this endothelial damage and improved the endothelium to a humongous degree, like really, really good results.
Yeah.
And again, in that review article, they were showing like a huge improvement in peripheral vascular disease as a result. Even so, like really hardcore outcome measures like digital subtraction angiography, so like injecting a contrast dye and then looking at it on a real-time x-ray like a CT, and you see the dye sort of come down the vessel. And classically, from when I was working in vascular department at the hospital, it just hits a blockage, right? And you want it to keep communicating down into the foot, say, and it's just blocks. And it's so plain and simple sort of approach to like, oh, there's the blockage. And then the vascular surgeon goes in and either tries to, burrow through the blockage, put a stent in, or you see these collateral supplies. So the body recognizes that it's not getting as much blood down into the limb or the affected area. So it will try and grow new blood vessels to try and reach its way down there. And in these patients, after saunaing, I think it was a randomized control trial, multi-center, pretty well powered. I'd be lying if I made up the numbers, but I was happy with the powering of the study. And hugely improved angiogenesis. Like all the collateral supply was markedly improved in the saunaing people. I think that was a 2-week period. I could be wrong, but it's a very quick response to improving the blood flow around the body.
Interesting. Which
you're targeting the tissue, the skin, right?
Yes.
And the systemic response is increased heart rate, increased stroke volume. So you're pulsing more blood through the body, which is probably amplifying the body's natural response to a blockage and saying, oh, we really need to find a new way to communicate with the distal limb. Impressive.
That's very impressive, yeah. Very impressive. I think, we're talking about improving cardiovascular outcomes, and we're talking about improving peripheral vascular outcomes here. What would be really interesting is to find evidence, like hard evidence of you stimulating skin, potentially capillaries and smaller vessels, and then if you could check and take samples of the skin and then take samples of some distal tissue, whether it be, this is like a hypothetical scenario, if you could check the liver, check the gut, check lung tissue, if you could check all the tissues and see what was happening in these tissues, what was activated, what was deactivated in the setting of heat shock to essentially one tissue, and then measure the serology and figure out what blood biomarkers are raised and what are decreased. And then you could start building a picture of how stressing the skin like that is affecting these distal tissues.
The systemic
and in what particular way.
Points.
I don't think we have that information, but it would I feel like it would be exceedingly interesting.
Yes, yeah, because then you could draw much easier parallels with what else is working, and it sort of adds to the whole body of knowledge around fasting and exercise and why it's good.
Because improving angiogenesis is a whole other kettle of fish. I mean, angiogenesis is a insane process.
Yes.
Really. I mean, you're growing new blood vessels.
Yeah.
And to have sauna improve that process, it's a really... Because in a sense, it's a regulated form of going back to embryological development.
Yeah.
And so you're targeting certain areas of the body and saying, well, we need you to go back to this embryological state and grow more stuff. In a similar way to wound healing, when you cut the skin, it says, well, we need you to go back to embryological state and try and heal this area. And what I find extraordinarily interesting is that whole process is regulated by senescent cells as well. But functional senescent cells as opposed to dysfunctional ones. And so it could be that these heat shock proteins are stimulating a organismal state that is predisposing towards the proper function of senescent cells.
Yeah, you're right. That would be extremely fascinating to get those end outcomes. The only thing they've done that sort of is leading down that same path is identify which heat shock proteins are produced in which tissues in response. So the heat shock proteins is like a family, very widely conservative mechanism through different organisms on our world, but like there's certain heat shock proteins that are involved with spermatogenesis. There's certain heat shock proteins that are involved with different processes around the body. So they've done that level of study. But looking at the end outcome of what those heat shock proteins do, and measuring those levels would be very interesting.
It's probably a bit unfortunate they're called heat shock proteins in the sense that
I agree.
It puts blinkers on what you think it does.
Yeah, stress response. Or something like that would be much better.
But I think it just comes back to the fact that they were discovered in the context of heat shock.
Yeah.
But no doubt these are incredibly important molecules that sit at this nexus point of something.
Yes, yeah.
What would be... I'm not sure if the studies have been done looking at like heat shock protein knockout models in mice and that sort of stuff. I'm sure it's been done, but I haven't looked at any of the literature. But it would be really interesting to see what an organism looks like without heat shock proteins. Whether it's even compatible with survival.
What I have seen about knocking out heat shock proteins is much more to do with cancer-related research.
Yeah, okay.
Because, interestingly, because of this protective, autophagy style approach to looking at heat shock proteins, cancer cells do upregulate certain heat shock proteins as a family, and it does seem to increase certain heat shock proteins, which will be involved in longevity of the cancer cell or the tumour. And they have knocked out heat shock protein 7 and 5 or something like that, certain ones. And it helped to kill the cancer cell, which is exciting for, I think breast cancer was highly implemented in this approach. Exciting for cancer research, right? Like in treating cancer. But it speaks to the idea if you knock out heat shock proteins, what happens to the organism? I think that's the only level that I've seen that at.
Still super interesting.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely having an effect. So I think I broadly sit in the, putting on my GP hat and giving health advice. Not that I am giving health advice to...
No health advice in this podcast. It's just pure speculation.
Disclaimer every single time. But the idea of good basic advice for healthy living, right, is fasting or calorie restriction for sure, right? There's almost no downside. Exercise, for sure. Almost no downside. Guaranteed to be good for you. Sauna is number 3 on that list for me.
I think so, yeah.
There's almost no downside. It's got...
Well, sleep hygiene, I think, would be higher up.
Ooh, potentially. Yeah. Would I rank it? Yeah, I would. I would definitely rank it higher.
Terry's top 5.
Basically. Yeah. Yeah, sleep is probably more important. But yeah, like you've said, it's an enjoyable thing to do as well. There's not too many people that don't like. Some people, like my brother, for example, just says you just sit there and sweat. Like,
Yeah.
that sounds horrible. It's kind of true. I can see that approach.
Yeah.
But there's something very relaxing about it. Something very conducive to good conversation when you do it with someone.
Yeah.
Like some of the best conversations I've had with my father-in-law have been sitting in the sauna.
Yeah.
Or we have a movie app just on the TV that's exterior on the other wall of the shed. Remote control sitting inside, and it's got speakers in this sauna. It's a very
it's
nice
the Gucci
atmosphere.
sauna. Yeah.
Oh, interestingly, actually, some of these studies that I looked at had the methodology of 30 minutes in the sauna, or even 20 minutes in the sauna, 60, 65 degrees, coming out and then lying supine, so lying down and putting a blanket on for about 30 minutes or so. And I didn't really have time to delve into why they did that.
Yeah.
Jeff and I came out of the sauna the other day and just lied down, no blanket, for about 10 minutes, just to see if it made us feel any sort of different.
Yeah.
And it was extremely relaxing.
Yeah, I imagine.
Because you see with that sleep mechanism, we're just like, oh, I feel nice and sleepy and relaxed. But I wasn't really sure why these studies were doing it that way. And they randomized that, so like the control arm would have a period where they just lied down for 30, 45 minutes as well. To see if it was just that rest factor. Still showed a big difference, so didn't seem to be a controlling mechanism. But I wondered why you would even do that in the first place.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I'm not too sure. I'll have to look into it and mention it again in a future podcast.
I can't think of a good mechanism, but...
Me neither.
I don't know.
Yeah.
What do I know?
Yeah. I'm just a guy here.
Yeah. Maybe if you look deep down, and that study was funded by a big blanket.
Yes.
Trying to shunt their products into the research. Sauna with blanket.
Yeah, done deal. They mentioned in that review study, one of the mechanisms they commented on for each of their studies is a Cochrane tool for bias or
the risk of bias tool.
Yeah. It's just such a good tool, right? Such a good thing to touch on.
That's all right.
Because
I've done Cochrane reviews.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Not bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Assessing quality of evidence is a whole thing.
Yeah.
It's a real art.
Which I think is gaining traction in the lay people society because of, that fake news approach, the Trump approach to media and things like that. It is that you can, if you search for what you're looking for, you'll find it.
Yeah.
So being aware, that's probably the biggest life skill at the moment, right?
It has to be up there for sure. Figuring
out what information is good in this.
I have no idea what the schooling system is doing these days. But certainly, when I was at school, I think the huge, massive information wasn't as big an issue. The internet was still pretty new. Not that new, but... so I finished school in 2006. So the internet was like... Not new, but it was like not as developed. It was still that sort of prepubescent internet.
It wasn't as integrated.
YouTube was still new.
Yeah.
Facebook hadn't really come around
to Australia at least.
Yeah, we had like a really early Wikipedia. And so, the internet just wasn't the tool that it is right now. But also, it wasn't this source of tremendous disinformation.
Yeah, I would agree.
Information overload. So, we were taught a little bit about like critical reasoning and assessing evidence, but it wasn't like a huge focus. But clearly, I think, as you were mentioning, this needs to become the main focus of education, because it doesn't become what the information is anymore. Like search isn't an issue. I remember growing up learning how to search information in an encyclopedia. That's not a problem. You can just Google search it. Our search algorithms are really good. And so once you learn how to search the internet, fine, job done. But then the question really becomes, how do you figure it out? And that's not trivial at all.
Not at all. Yeah. And it's even a struggle for trained scientists like you and I. Like you've really got to keep it in the forefront of your mind. And I get excited. Like, obviously, I enjoy saunas, so I get a little biased. Like,
yeah, for
I'm
sure.
looking at the research.
Sure.
Like, yeah, see, it's good.
Yeah, yeah.
You've got to be a good scientist. You got to trust but verify.
Yeah.
Which is the motto of the European Science Society, isn't it? I screwed that term up. The big science group in England.
Yeah.
That's the motto of their entire society. Trust but verify.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it's the number one life skill. There needs to be a shift towards figuring out what information is good and communicating that information. Communication in general, right?
Yeah.
Being able to express yourself appropriately and correctly, more succinctly, and to a wider range of audiences.
Mm.
Like, you and I talk on a different level when we're at work versus socially versus on a podcast. Like, and it's seamless for us, but you got to keep it in mind when you're dealing with different patient populations. Different, you got to sort of meet people where they are.
Yeah,
and it's a skill to, one, figure out where they are, and then two, use communication skills and tools that meet them at that level. I've always found that very interesting in medicine, that we go into such crazy depths of how to explain it to each other.
Yep.
And then it becomes useless as soon as you actually give it to the person who matters, which is the patient.
Yeah. Yeah. There's at medical school you get taught about, like, paternalistic medicine. That, it's modern medicine isn't about doctors making decisions for patients. It's about patients taking autonomy for their care. Shared decision making. But that is truly, I believe, in many respects, a complete illusion, because I'm guilty of it. I'm sure you're guilty of it, of presenting information a certain way to a patient. Yes. In order to facilitate their decision, which is essentially the same as making the decision for them. Yeah. And the only real difference is that you'll have, like, an old patient who's used to paternalistic care, and they'll say, "Doc, just make the decision. Just, I'll do whatever you say.
Whatever's best." Yeah. You're the doctor.
You're the doctor. Versus, like, a young patient in their 20s who comes in who has expectations about, like, wanting to understand everything. But the reality is, like, that you're not really going to. Yeah. Right. As a patient,
you can't get past that fact. There's a strong hierarchy that is almost always going to be there. Between the balance of power is firmly in our court, right? Like, we can see what your condition is, what the probable outcomes are, in a way that is extremely difficult to put across to a patient, especially in neutral language, almost impossible. If you're getting consent for a patient, there's a difference between getting consent just ahead of the surgery that they're already booked in for, and how you're going to frame that, versus really approaching a consent to a surgery on an equivocal basis where they could or could not have it, and it really is up to them how they want to approach it. It's a very interesting balance of power.
And there's something different. The idea of consenting someone for procedure is such a weird concept, because you can tell someone there's 10% risk of this, or 15% risk of that, or 0.1% risk of this. But those are sort of meaningless numbers. And even when you say, like, it's about the same risk as getting in a car accident when you go for a drive, or you can sort of equate it to things that people have more understanding of. But even that is sort of useless, because nobody jumps into a car expecting to get hit. You know what I mean? The probability is absolutely meaningless to someone, especially in a situation where their health is the issue. And so, I guess we could talk a little bit about, like, what the medical law says on that particular subject, but maybe that's a bit useless.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
But I don't know if you remember studying Rogers and Whittaker, the classic legal case. Yeah, the sympathetic ophthalmoplegia.
Yes. That's a good example.
It's a classic example of what is important in a consent. Because this patient had one eye, and they're having an operation on the other, on
the remaining eye.
On the remaining eye. Yeah. No, that's not quite right. They were having an operation on, like, the bad eye, to fix the bad eye, but there was a really, really small chance
of affecting
it affecting the other eye. Yeah. And it's an exceedingly rare complication of the procedure that this person was having.
So rare that it's not normally mentioned, right?
Yeah, exactly
and
right.
Wasn't in this case.
Yeah, but for this particular person, having eyesight was really, really important.
Yeah. Yep.
More so than for other people. Now, I can't remember the exact facts on the ground.
I think the argument was that because there is a risk to the healthy eye, that risk should have been conveyed to this particular patient because the healthy eye is so consequential.
Yes.
Whereas normally, like if you damage one eye, your other eye is probably going to be enough to live a normal life. But it wasn't so for this patient.
Correct.
That healthy eye is the only option. So anything affecting that healthy eye was deemed in this court case to be extremely relevant and should have been mentioned.
Yep.
But the common approach is to not even mention that risk because it's inconsequential to a normal patient.
The common approach at the time.
Yeah.
Now, I think the medical practice after this sort of decision was passed down and it became apparent that mentioning risks was, even really rare risks, is super important, might have swung to this sort of extreme for a period of time where you just mentioned all the risks.
Yeah. Yep.
Which actually is not the thrust of the legal decision. The legal decision really was saying you need to have a patient-doctor relationship, and as the doctor you need to know what are the risks that are important to that patient, which means getting to know them, figuring out what's important to them. And I think that's the fundamental difference, but that almost rarely happens. And part of the issue is that you're part of this big team, especially on like a procedural unit like surgery, that's moving really fast. Patients are always coming through. And although this patient might have seen the surgeon in outpatient clinic or something, you've been asked to go see them to reiterate the consent, but you don't really know them as well as you might need to in order to make that happen. And what's worse is oftentimes in the public healthcare system, depending on the surgical specialty, the actual surgeon themselves might not even see the patient until the day of surgery.
Yeah.
They might not have done the consent. And so the person who's ultimately responsible for that surgery is sort of out of the picture until the day.
Yeah, removed from the process.
Yeah. And they're trusting you as the junior to have that relationship and do it for them.
Yeah.
But because the responsibilities aren't coupled, you as the junior aren't the primary surgeon. You'll be assisting or helping or doing something like that. You might not take that responsibility as seriously
as you should. Yeah.
And so probably I would imagine consents are hopefully done better in private, where surgeons have a one-to-one relationship with the patient
and tend to know them better.
Yeah. But
I agree.
But maybe not.
You can see the difference, right? I remember being in Hawaii, my only trip to America, and seeing the medications being advertised on TV like during ad breaks.
Yeah.
And they did what you...
See your doctor.
Yeah. They've done what you correctly articulated there, that the thrust of that case was sort of misinterpreted. And so they give all these random risks associated with medications as a byproduct of trying to meet legal requirements. Where really the only risks that matter are ones that are going to be contextual for the patient. Yeah, you've articulated that really well. I hope to be that GP who can contextualize things for my patients.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating approach. Which is, to link it to saunas is the same thing, right? Saunas I can almost universally recommend, but needs to be contextualized for particular patients.
Yep. Could I also just defend the position of the junior doctor who's caught in this sort of position where they can't they can't necessarily get like full consent all the time in the way that you'd want to. And part of the reason is like, okay, you need to get to know the patient, you need to this, but you have only 4.5-5 minutes to see this patient before you need to go, because if you spend too much time with one patient, then other patients miss out.
Correct.
So it's an optimization problem. You have X amount of time, and you go in and you can't rush a relationship with someone. If you start being like, so what's important to you in like this setting, people are going to be like, a lot of people, respond negatively to excessive, trying to find excessive personal information. Classic example of that actually is when you're asking an elderly person, like, oh, is anyone at home with you? And you're asking them like, and they don't know you at all. And you're asking them like, are you home alone? And some people get really offended by that. Some people are like, why
does that matter?
Why does that matter? Like, and it does matter, because when they leave the hospital, they might need someone to care for them.
Heavily involved in discharge planning, right?
But it's janky and weird to ask that straight out of the blue. It's janky and weird to be like, look, I need to ask you this because to explain why you're asking it. There's no good solutions except for having a better relationship with patients from time and chatting and like having that sort of more personal relationship, which you're just not going to get because you have 5 minutes.
I agree to an extent, but I also think it's hackable. I think communication is much more concrete than people give it reason to be, I think.
Yeah,
and that's,
potentially.
That's a byproduct of being a Deakin University student, I think. Like, I've got plenty of complaints about medical schools, don't get me wrong, but what Deakin does really well is communication.
Yeah.
And they taught it in a very concrete, semi-clunky way. Like, you had these actors where, as long as you did what the teaching was, the actors responded positively. You know, it's a bit biased, but it's amazing how well it works in the real world. I've been blown away by the effects I get from patients by using really simple, straightforward communication techniques that you feel even silly doing because you're like, surely you realize what I'm doing when I say these certain sentences or certain structures to this approach. But it works so well. And the best example of this is goals of care. Yeah. So our hospital, most hospitals have this, but our hospital has this policy of you need some sort of documentation about what this patient would want done in an emergency. Because very, people reflexively want everything done, right? Yeah. Like if you're a healthy 34, if we went into hospital, it would be a very quick conversation. The doctor would be like, I assume you're a healthy young male. I assume you want us to do everything possible to keep you as such. And the answer is yes. I would want full ICU care. I'd be happy to be intubated, hooked up to a breathing machine, because I've got a really good chance of returning to my baseline because I'm starting in such a good position. Not so much if you're a 90-year-old frail coming in with heavy comorbidities. You're on the cusp of needing, ongoing home supports or heading towards a nursing home environment for safety. That's a very different conversation, because if they do have a massive cardiac event or a stroke or something like that, a lot of people are relieved to have this conversation to say, yes, I would just want to be left alone. Want to be made comfortable and pass away. Yeah. So I took it as a personal challenge, being a junior doctor, to get good at these conversations quickly. Yeah. And I have found it to be rather hackable. I can do most of my goals of care in 3 or 4 minutes without sort of upsetting the patient. But that's through a lot of errors as well. Like it's trial by error. Yeah, okay. I've learned to really introduce it in a particular way, because asking someone, what do you want to do if you were on the cusp of dying, is a sensitive topic. Yeah. But using a few sort of basic strategies, you can bring it up almost with anyone without eliciting a panicked sort of response. That's why I think communication is such a good life skill. Yeah, and definitely. It's much more hackable than people think.
I want to just touch on this goals of care thing a little bit more, because I had an idea that I want to run by you, because I think oftentimes you'll meet the old person who defies the risk scores. Yeah, yes. Someone who doesn't look crisp, but they make it through, and they chuff on, and so there's clearly a subclass of elderly people who do warrant ICU care, but who don't immediately obviously look like they would. Yes. And one thing that I think would be interesting is if you could measure their epigenetic clock, like say a Horvath clock or something along those lines, and see if you could stratify elderly people by that. Yes. And so provide like a biological mechanism for directing goals of care and like how much care someone would be able to handle.
I'm so excited by that idea. Yes, I think that'd be fantastic.
It'd just be really cool in an elderly query ICU population. Sample it, measure it, see if there's a correlation.
There's ease of testing, bedside testing, fast result, 100%. Because I think the night you and I were working together, the night we did the sleep podcast, I think it was that night, we had a patient come into ED that was 100 or 101 something. And I remember chatting with the MedReg, who I completely understand their position, but I thought it was just interesting that I said to them, what did you put as their goals of care? And they sort of said, well, what would you put? Which was a fair enough question. Yeah. And I risk stratified. I said, well, actually they are on medication, medications, which is neither here nor there for people in that age category, because a lot of the time they'll stop medications because it's no perceived benefit. But they were legitimately not on many medications because they didn't have many comorbidities at all. I think they had some hearing impairment. They didn't have any diabetes or anything. They didn't have any heart disease.
Yep.
They did have one or two comorbidities, but weren't consequential towards their outcome. So I said, well, actually, I think I would put this, like, depending on what they said, obviously, it's shared decision making.
Yep.
I would do a trial of HDU, I think I ended up settling on. And my colleagues were sort of like, no, we just put ward-based. It was a very quick conversation.
Yep.
But again, it's that power of the doctor framing the conversation.
For sure.
Would have said, look, you're probably not going to have a good experience if we shove a tube down your throat and
Exactly.
breathe for you. Like using language like that, right?
Exactly.
Rather than saying, assist you with your breathing.
Yeah.
Versus shove a tube down your throat.
Two ways of framing the
which paints a picture in the patient's mind. Yeah. I agree. There's sort of a, not saying ageist, but like sort of a, well, you're in that category where it's not going to be good. But who knows? The reason you've made it to 100 with relatively few comorbidities.
They might have an epigenetic clock of a 65-year-old.
So like, maybe your chronological age does not match your phenotypic
Maybe they
age.
could. Maybe if you gave them some inotropes, they'd pull through.
I love that idea. It's a very interesting approach.
It'd just be a curious use of the biological clock in a hospital setting. The challenges to that study, I think, would be how quick you can run the DNA methylation panel to get an answer.
And how well that correlated with things like inotropes, airway support.
Well, what my argument would be, in a pilot study like this where you recruited, I don't know, 100, 200 people going into ICU who are old, it wouldn't matter how quick the assay was because you're just looking and seeing what happens. And so it's just a cohort study.
I like it. Let's do it.
It would be cool. Man.
Let's run that study.
Might shoot off some emails then.
That's. I love adding hard outcome measures to things that are traditionally thought to be wishy-washy and incorrectly perceived to always remain so.
Yeah.
This is great.
Good conversation. Just because a lot of times you'll look at an elderly person who might have problems with mobility, right? And that immediately makes them look frail and makes them look like, they don't have long for this world. But why do they have problems with mobility? Is it truly degenerative disease, or did they have an accident at some stage? I mean, there's a lot of reasons why someone might be in that situation. And so it might be the case that your traditional frailty scores or metrics might not necessarily fit the particular
correctly score this patient.
And you want to get a general gestalt overview of their biological state, and I think a biological clock might be a reasonable approach. It would certainly be a helpful bit of data that could be readily used, I think. And, if you could prove cost effectiveness of using this to stratify people, then it might be the case that if you're over 65, you immediately get, on arrival to hospital, if you're being admitted, a biological clock assay done to help direct the level of treatment that you would need. That would be like what I would think.
I think the cost effectiveness would be very easy to argue, right? Because ICU is expensive. Beds in ICU cost a lot of money. The staffing that goes into it, the medications involved, the equipment and technology that's there. There's a lot of money there.
There's potential. There's potential for a cost effectiveness argument, but you need to prove it.
Heuristically, I'm on board.
That
would be a good study. You got me thinking now.
That's what I'd do.
Definitely. Cool. All right, should we wrap it up?
I think we should.
Yep.
What are we at? Anyway, let's wrap it up.
Cool. Thanks, man.
No.
Good to see you again.
What do you want to talk about next time?
I think we should look at getting some guests on.
Your mate,
I'm
really interested to chat to him about his experiences with like bipolar disorder and lithium and all that kind of stuff. Should be good.
The ultimate goal is to get my father-in-law on.
Oh, absolutely. That's
come on.
That'll be the pinnacle of this podcast.
yes, definitely. Great. All right, man. Thanks.
Adios.